The Process, a podcast about creativity and experimental music. In the world of experimental music, outcomes and accolades for creators can be uncertain and at times seem far and few between. Therefore, creators and practitioners of experimental music must embrace the one thing they will always have complete control over: the process. This podcast aims to understand this creative process by listening to new works and discussing them with their creators. Each episode focuses on one creator and their music. Understanding how and why they create can inform aspiring creatives and help audiences better understand and navigate experimental music. I'm Dr. Doug Bielmeyer, and I'll be your host as we explore the world of experimental music, creativity, and the human need to find purpose in their world and lives. This is The Process.
Well, Ghost Ensemble is a group of musicians based in New York. We got together in our earliest incarnation in 2012. And we've had a lot of musicians over the years, but from the beginning has been me on accordion and Sky McClay on oboe, and also composing for the ensemble. James Ilgenfritz joined on
Right.
contrabass soon thereafter. And we have flute, Margaret Lancaster, percussion, Chris Nappy, viola, Martine Thomas, cello, TJ Borden, and second bass, Kyle Model, and our conductor, Carl Bettendorf. That's the personnel, at least on the ReWild album. We do
Mhm.
have other guests and friends sometimes.
And what was sort of the impetus or the mission of this ensemble?
Well, I wanted to be able to make music with the same people over a long period of time so that we could really explore concepts and themes and so forth over
Mhm.
time. And I wanted to be able to grow work in that slow way of, workshopping possibly amorphous concepts that might take a longer time to germinate.
Yeah.
And over the years, we've developed this working method of creating work over a long period of time. And I think that really allows a different type of music to emerge because, you can be experimental and then also methodical with your experiments and grow things in a more in a fuller way, or at least that's what I found works really, really nicely for me.
That's really interesting because, I often think about my own creative process and, there's a call, there's some type of performance and you write a piece and the piece gets performed, maybe you record it. And I find a lot of times it's like the original version that I wrote 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. By the time it gets on an album or is like remixed, reperformed, it morphs into this whole other thing. And now there's all these artifacts of all its different stages of development. It's kind of like looking at photos of yourself, growing up over the years, but it's a musical piece. So this is kind of interesting. One of the ideas behind this ensemble is to allow that sort of space for an idea to sort of germinate and sort of grow.
Sure, exactly. Yeah, and that's certainly the case with our commissions too. When we work
Mhm.
with external composers, we just
Mhm.
this month we're putting out our record with Cat Lamb, and
Great.
that piece has grown even since we've premiered it and toured it.
Mhm.
We've traded some notes around a little bit,
Sure. Yeah.
and it's continued to sort of settle into its ideal state. And I think that's really important to allow music to emerge in that way, just so that
What?
I've had so many projects, as you sort of
Sure.
implied earlier, that that felt like they could have benefited from so much more growth, but
Sure.
or that there's another level that could um, to which they could evolve
Sure.
given enough time. And I really mean that it's not about having 2 more weeks to finish or something.
Right, right. Like the
But
deadline, if you had, yeah, 2 more weeks, we could have, done
right,
this or
but
that.
about that sort of like slow unconscious germination, and that period of reflection where you go back to something and you think,
Right.
oh, okay, that's how this felt last June, but actually this part is, and just let that be part of the period of the piece still growing.
Yeah, there's that like kernel of idea that maybe sometimes, when I'm creating, there's like this exciting moment where I have this idea and that kernel, that thing that becomes the piece. And, sometimes I get to the end of the process and I'm like, I'm not sure I really fully realized that kernel or that idea. So do you think that's one of the advantages of this kind of like slower process?
I certainly think so, and that's was one of the main sort of founding impulses of Ghost Ensemble, was to have the opportunity to work that way, and to work that way with musicians who could grow the piece together. So, the roles of composer and performer could really interweave in that way over the course of the process. This piece emerged over the course of a couple of years, and it was an immense gift to have the musicians of Ghost Ensemble and time with them at several different points in that process. So I could begin with gathering tons and tons of little musical kernels, just little ideas, unconscious, popping out whenever on napkins and paper all over the place,
right,
or the computer or anything else.
Yeah.
And then assemble these into potential structures, and then, bring those sketches to Ghost Ensemble, try them out, record them, listen to them many, many times over the course of several months, recombine them into what really felt right, take out the parts that didn't quite feel right, grow the parts that felt like they might have something more in them, bring it to the group again, try it out again, record it again, and then still make revisions for the final piece. There's no way this piece could exist without that method.
And so when you're doing recordings, are you sort of using this as a documentation to kind of evaluate and reconstruct, or are you actually sort of using those recordings? How is this getting written on a page in some way, or directions or graphics?
Sure. ReWild is pretty traditional notation, bar by bar, metered, conducted.
Sure.
But more in my music, more generally, I'll work in other ways with text, with graphics as well.
Sure.
With chatting, chatting, and let's try out this thing.
Right.
And if those rehearsal workshop recordings of ReWild, there's certainly some of that too. I think at one point I said, okay, let's play what you think it feels like to be an octopus. Okay, let's play what you think it feels like to be a slime mold.
Right.
And we didn't end up, using that material directly, but I think it helped us get into the headspace of some of the ideas.
So is there then sort of an improvisational aspect to this, or sort of you said it kind of blurring the lines between sort of performer and composer. Are you relying on Ghost Ensemble to kind of give some sort of improvisatory or component, sort of performance component to the compositional process?
Well, that's a great question, and that's also, part of the foundational idea of Ghost Ensemble is that we are all flexible improvisers. People, we all love to improvise and do so, and are absolutely happy to bring that to the creative process. Some composers have engaged with that more. Some will bring a fully notated sketch and say, let's play through this, do it. Quarter note equals,
right.
1/16. And everything in between. And that's great. What I really want is to create a sort of soil for possibility and try to remove as many boxes, walls, preconceptions, limitations as possible.
Right. And they can be there if the composer or the people want, but they don't have to be. And so it seems like a really sort of open space. And then a space where you can also get feedback. Not just like this harmonic doesn't work, but kind of like, hey, when we play this passage, it feels like the movement or the momentum is not quite there or something. Yeah.
I mean, the bottom line is, it's about creating a new work together and just being, everyone being on the same team of what beautiful thing can we create together. when I had the idea for the piece, one of the sort of original organizing principles was these ideas I'm fascinated by, and this goes beyond ReWild, of time perception and time scales, and how music, through the experiential time-based nature of it, can help us reorient our time perception.
Sure.
And so we have these, at least and I think many of us have these sort of normative ways of experiencing the world that orient us toward to experience time in a certain way.
Sure.
Which is to say the scales that help us function in our daily lives.
Right.
And at the same time, we are aware of the timescales of other beings that function differently.
Sure.
Right.
Especially a piece like ReWild, which is almost 50 minutes long, there's a significant passage of time for a piece of music.
Yeah.
In which you can kind of manipulate and play with, like you said, our perception of that time, and just the movement from one thing to the next.
I was also thinking of the, pitch noise spectrum as a parameter, and trying to move to different locations in that spectrum. And I love glissandi. That's probably the most honest and simple way to put it.
Yeah.
But I also was trying to think of static tones and moving tones as also a spectrum of exploring the distance from the whole spectrum in the parameter from a totally static tone, which is very striking, right? And a very fast glissando.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of space there for like slightly wavering tones, poco vibrato, oscillato, or slower or faster slides to a new pitch.
And the notes between the pitches, and then also, sometimes like overshooting a little bit. So if you're going from like B to A, sometimes it's a little above B and it goes a little bit below A, and that can be really exciting too. And that's all those thresholds you're kind of talking about, where it's like we have these markers of like, that's an A, that's a B, no wait, it's somewhere in between.
Exactly. I tried to make sure not to let anything be too spot on. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It feels more true to some kind of organic way approach, and I wanted to let everything be a little in between.
At around halfway through the piece, or at around 23 minutes, there's a moment where I believe the oboe and the harp, as well as the accordion, start to play these like honest is a weird word, but like just straightforward gestures, where I'm like, okay, now I'm hearing a pitch and a rhythm and a gesture as we conventionally think about it. And that it was shocking to me that I was like, oh, that's right. We haven't had that yet. And I didn't notice it before, because I was just really, even the more like sort of homophonic part, early on in the piece, where there's a lot of stacking of notes and kind of chords, if you will, you're right. They're never quite arriving at something really stacking up until about 23 minutes. So what was the sort of impetus for that? Was that kind of one of your kernels, your ideas about maybe having an arrival much later in the piece?
A really important aspect of working on the piece was taking a bunch of different sketches and listening and workshopping them with Ghost Ensemble and recording them, and then listening to them in many different orders. And so the part of the piece that you're talking about is a sketch, or maybe a couple of sketches, that weren't necessarily intended to be in any particular point in the piece initially, but that ended up in that position through a process of listening to many different possibilities, and that's what felt right. And I had a bunch of pieces of paper taped to each other on my wall.
Yeah.
Probably that one. And just tried moving these numbers all around of these different sketches.
Yeah.
And it ended up feeling right there, I think, because, there's this very long process of getting to that point, and then a very long process after that point, right, where it goes entirely elsewhere.
Yeah, and that's interesting. You mentioned too about the process there of actually physically putting sections of music on a wall and kind of looking at them and kind of moving them around like, pieces of a puzzle. Is it like the actual score, or is it kind of like representations of it? How are you dealing with time and scale? Like, are you visually saying like, oh, that's physically too long or something,
So in terms of actually the plotting things on the wall, that wasn't the score itself, because that would have been way too much material. But I had a little shorthand of just every sketch had a random number, like there was 64 and like 137 and like 692, and I just made sure.
So it wasn't like A, B, C, D, and E.
No, because
sketch.
I wanted.
Okay.
Well, I wanted to make sure that I didn't unconsciously follow something. I also didn't want to confuse myself with rehearsal marks, because as I was engraving, rehearsal marks would change constantly as I moved things around.
Sure.
So these were just the shorthand, random, essentially, numbers that I was using for these different sketches. And then I'd have piles and piles of sketches to remind myself which one was which. And then, that was a process of listening and really determining that order. But, there was some sense of, okay, we're going to start with these parameters in this space, and there's going to be a very gradual evolution through all of these different other spaces in all these different parameters.
Did you find the recordings were helpful with that too? Just kind of to be able to maybe listen to a section for like sort of a temporal kind of like, okay, that felt long after this, or contiguous with this, or
immensely helpful. And as you were saying, that also let me determine, okay, I think this section should be considerably longer. This one's not working. I need to toss it, plenty of that, of course. Okay, this one, actually, we got the point after 2 minutes, but this one feels like it's just starting, or I didn't hang out here long enough. Like this, I need to let this develop or cook a little bit longer here in this spot. Yeah, exactly. And all of that was really listening based and just, feeling what sounds right. So in other words, I also wanted to make sure not to over determine my system, and insist on anything that didn't sound right.
Well, fantastic, Ben. It's been fantastic talking with you, talking about Ghost Ensemble as well as your piece, ReWild. Before I let you go, can you tell us a little bit about how we can learn more about you, your music, and the Ghost Ensemble?
Sure. Ghostensemble.org and benrichtermusic.com. We'll have a great deal of resources.
Great deal. Thanks to Ben for sharing his time and music with us. Please check out other episodes in the series, and feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment on your preferred podcasting app. I'm Dr. Doug Bielmeyer, and this has been The Process.